Hello and welcome back to the Joyful Soul Creates. Charlotte here, and today I'm sharing my card for the new Kawaii release at Stampers Delights, which is full of cute Halloween images. I'm working with Pumpkin Pete for my card, and that digi stamp set comes with little Pete in his pumpkin costume, a pumpkin image, and also a sentiment. I've arranged the pumpkin image into a pumpkin patch of sorts just by duplicating the image multiple times, that some of them have been flipped so that they're the opposite way around, and some are bigger than the others, the bigger ones in the front and the smaller ones at the back, just because that's how perspective works. I will be turning this into a pull tab slider, and I will show you exactly how I have done that later on in the video after all the colouring. So this is a bit of a longer video because of having that technique included, but I hope you will stick around to watch it all, because I do also have tips on what to do when things go wrong and that kind of thing, so hopefully you'll find it interesting. So I'm starting out by colouring my pumpkins, and I'm going with a kind of muted orange for these, using my Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers, which are my go-to markers. I do have the caps showing on screen so you can see what colours I am using. That little piece of washi tape is just so I have somewhere to place the caps and not get a mess on my card whilst I'm colouring. So my darkest shade is actually a golden brown, and I'm underpainting with that and then going in with amber, which is one of the burnt oranges. And I'm working with my shadows primarily in the kind of ridges of the pumpkin, as those are folded in, so to say, so they would have a shadow area there. But I'm also putting my shadows to an extent over to the left hand side, because I usually colour with my light source coming from the right, and also shadows at the bottom of the pumpkins and very slightly around the tops as well where it's curving in. This just helps it look a bit more dimensional. I'm going through colouring these one at a time from start to finish. You could, if you prefer, put the darkest colour on all of the pumpkins and then the next one and keep working through a colour at a time rather than a pumpkin at a time, but I just felt this worked better for me today. Some of them I think I did forget to put in the golden brown as the underpainted darkest tone. It doesn't matter too much, it just means they'll look slightly different from the other ones, but I think that variation is a bit more natural. So yeah, it's not the end of the world if you forget to do that. I did also switch my lightest colour because I'd started off with, I think, the Mimosa golden yellow colour, and that turned out to be running a bit dry, so I did switch to GY3 instead, which is gold, and they're very similar colours anyway, and that one was less dry, so it was easier to work with. So I'll just go in and finish the last little pumpkin, and then I'm going to colour Pumpkin Pete's costume, his little pumpkin on his head. I did start off with the same shades for his pumpkin, so again going in with that raw sienna in the kind of folds of the pumpkin and around the bottom as well, then using the BO3, the amber, to go over that and just draw it out a little bit. I am using kind of flicking motions to soften the lines and make the blend easier. Then I used BO2, which is mango, again drawing out the colour a bit further each time as I went. And finally I used the GY3, that's golden yellow. Obviously, Pumpkin Pete is not wearing a real pumpkin on his head. This is a costume, so I thought it would be more of an artificial colour. So I did glaze over it with bright orange, which is OR3. Although later I decided that was a bit too intense, and I will glaze over it again to knock the colour back a bit. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. First, I'm going to colour in the stems and leaves on the pumpkins, and I'm doing these green. I use navy blue as an undertone. If you've watched my recent Halloween wreath video, I talked a bit there about the colours that you have in nature. In green you often have blue in the shadows and yellow in the highlights, so that's why I used the blue as the undertone here. I'm then using dull greens for my other shades on these areas. My lightest one, the bamboo, which is DG2, is also running quite dry. Quite a lot of my pens are running quite dry, actually. I do need to replace them. So I did struggle a little bit with that. I do find sometimes that switching to the brush end helps, because that seems to be wetter for whatever reason. So that is what I did. I'll use the greens again on Pumpkin Pete, and then as I said earlier, I'm going to glaze over that pumpkin on his head with the gold just to knock the colour back a bit. My camera died, so I lost a little bit of footage, but I just used a dark grey-green to colour in the mouths of the pumpkins, and then I'm going to move on to Pumpkin Pete's skin. I used a quite intense purple to underpaint his skin. This is because purple adds a nice richness to skin. I went with such an intense one because I'm going for quite a dark skin tone, but I think I went too intense because I did struggle with getting it to blend out nicely, and I had to work through quite a lot to make it not look just purple. I then went back through with all the layers of my skin except the purple to try and help blend that out, and that did work better in the end. So it worked out all right, but I think if I were to do it again, I would definitely not use quite such an intense purple for my underpainting. I'll then go and colour his hair, and then I'll use the same green-grey that I'd used for the pumpkin's mouths to colour around the opening of his costume. I did colour in the rest of him, but I decided to cut that out of the video because in the end the rest of him doesn't really show up on the finished card, so I didn't think it was worth leaving it in. So with everything coloured in, I'm going to fussy cut out my images. The pumpkins are going to be kind of like a border on my card, so I'm just fussy cutting around the top of them. I don't want to fussy cut the whole thing out because I want the sentiment to remain on the bottom of the panel, for example, so I'm just literally going along the top of the image with my scissors. And when you fussy cut, you want to move the paper, not your scissors. That's easiest, especially if you have a wrist injury like I do, which makes fussy cutting and colouring for that matter a little bit tricky. I then used a stitched edged rectangle die to cut out the remainder of that panel, and I'm going to use the same die to cut my background panel. I'm actually partially cutting it because I want this to end up longer than the die cuts. I'll also use a circle to cut out a tab in the top. That would just make it easier to hold on to the pull tab mechanism. I'm going to trim this background panel down. I did measure based on the size of my card base so that it will be nice and proportional. And here's how the layout's going to look. I then need to create my interactive element. So I've positioned Pete where I want him to be, hiding behind the pumpkin patch. And I'll draw in a line with him in his hidden position at the bottom of his feet and at the top of the pumpkin, or not quite the top, just behind where the stem is. And then I'll repeat marking the top once he is in the pulled up position, and I'll draw along that line. I actually realised I don't need to go all the way down to his feet because I'm going to have the pull tab mechanism behind his head, so I adjusted my marks appropriately. And I'm going to use the line I have drawn with my pencil to create a little opening in that back panel. I couldn't find my metal ruler. Actually, I don't think I've been able to find it for weeks. So I'm using the Cut Align from the MISTI to get that initial line cut through with my craft knife, and then I'll just pull out that little opening, and that's my slider channel. I then need to create the pull tab, so I'm using some leftover snippets of card that I had from creating the other elements, and I'm going to cut this down to be about the width of the opening, so I think that was 3/4 of an inch. And then I need another strip going across. So if you're not working with snippets, it's easiest just to create a T-piece in the first place. That's probably going to be much stronger than doing it this way, but it works well enough, so I didn't have a problem with it. So I'm going to adhere that cross piece to the long piece with some double-sided tape, fold the tabs in on either side and burnish them with my bone folder. And then I'm going to fold them into the middle and back, as you can see, and again burnish with my bone folder. And that bit's going to poke through the opening on my slider. So I'm again just checking the positioning of Pete, and then I'm going to have to just cut off the corners here so that the tab's not going to be showing from behind his head. I did miss a very important step here. One important thing when making interactive cards is always at every single stage, check that the interactive element works. So I should have done that before adhering peat into place, but alas, I did not. And I later had to come back and fix some issues, but you'll see that in a moment. So first I did stick peat onto the tab, and then I tried to pull my slider once he was stuck in place, and it would not move. Not in the slightest. So with some brute force, I managed to get it to move up a little and found out that at least I hadn't just glued him down to the back of the card, so that was fine. But the problem was that my channel was too narrow. So I'm going to just very, very carefully use my craft knife to widen the channel. And I'm putting a cutting board between Pete and the backing panel so that I'm not going to be cutting into him, as I'm using my craft knife to cut away the edges of the channel and make it wider. And it did slide a bit better, but it was still catching slightly, so I again went in and just widened it up a little bit more until it was moving fine. So as I said, it is very important that every step of the way you check that it's moving nicely, and then you'll avoid these kinds of issues. But at least with it going wrong, I was able to show you how to fix it. Next, I'm going to put in a little sleeve to hold on to the tab so it's not wiggling around. Here again, I went slightly wrong because I made it very slightly too tight. So I made this out of a snippet again. I folded it around the pull tab element, adhered it down, and then when I tried to slide it back over, I realized that the collar's a bit too tight. So I just opened it back up, and when I closed it this time I made sure not to do it quite so tight, and then it was able to move, so that was fine. Then I'm going to adhere it just below the semicircle opening, making sure that my pull tab is straight, and that will hold the pull tab and make sure it's not wiggling from side to side when I have it on my card. The little semicircle that I'd cut out of my original panel is going to be my reinforcement on the top of my pull tab, and I'm going to stamp Slide Me onto it. There are a number of stamp sets you can buy which have this Slide Me stamp in them. This one I'm using is from Heavy Doodle, and I just used one of my MISTI Creative Corners to help me get the stamp lined up on the semicircle and stamped it with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I will then adhere that with double-sided tape to my pull tab. I made sure that Pete was all the way down, then adhered it into place and cut off the excess of the pull tab, and again slid the slider to make sure it worked. Then I came to my next issue with creating the card, which was I had forgotten I'm basically out of foam tape, and that's kind of essential for making this. Luckily though, I have some fun foam which is adhesive backed, so I'm using the white fun foam to pop up the pumpkin patch panel, and I'm just cutting pieces so they will fit around Pete because of course we want to make sure he is still able to slide up and down nicely and that those pieces of adhesive aren't going to interfere with his movement. So I did mark on the card with a pencil how high up I could have my foam, put all the pieces into place, and then I'm going to put double-sided tape on top of them and burnish it in well with my bone folder because it can be quite difficult to get the backing off double-sided tape when it's on top of fun foam. So I did use my reverse tweezers as well to help me with getting that. And then to make sure that my panels are completely lined up, I'm going to put the back panel into the corner of my MISTI and use that to help me align the front panel. That makes sure they're nicely lined up and that I'm not going to mess up my entire card at this point. As I'm using a green card base, I thought I would use green fun foam for the back of the panel. Again, I want to make sure I'm not interfering with my slider mechanism, so I'm carefully measuring each of the pieces to make sure I avoid that. I do use my Fiskars paper trimmer to cut down the pieces of fun foam, but it doesn't actually cut all the way through because of the thickness. So then I also use my craft knife just to go along the line that my Fiskars trimmer made, just to finish cutting through. So I'll just get those 3 pieces of green fun foam into place. I apologise if you can see my camera charger wire off to the side of the frame. Sorry if that's annoying. I hadn't realised that it was visible, but I did have to have my camera plugged in so that I could make this card, because otherwise I would have had to wait for it to charge. Anyway, after checking that the slider mechanism still worked, I put the double-sided tape again onto the back of the green fun foam, again burnishing it down well with my bone folder, checking it still works, which it does, remove the backing from the foam with my reverse tweezers, and then I'll be able to put that onto my card base. And I actually stood up and looked through the camera to check that it looked straight on camera as well as in person, just to make sure I was getting it right. And then I just needed to fold the card shut, and that completed my Pull Tap Halloween card. I do hope you liked it. This actually took me about 2 hours to make. It probably would have been faster if not for my wrist slowing me down. But with all the colouring and the interactive element, it's definitely a time-consuming card, but I was so excited and happy when I'd finished it and it had worked, and I felt it's well worth the time that I put into it. And I hope you thought it was too. Do leave me a comment and let me know what your favourite kind of interactive card is. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button to let me know, and if you're not yet a subscriber, you can subscribe by clicking the button showing on screen now. There's also a couple of other videos there if you'd like to see more from me straight away. Otherwise, I'll thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again in the next video. Bye!